Classical mythologies have shaped the very world we live in.
Yeah, whatever. I don't have time for dense, dusty old books, Paul.
Great. Well, that's what podcasts are for.
Oh, good point.
Join me, Paul, as I teach my best friend and improv comedy partner, Sarah, all about mythology on Myth Understood.
Mythology is frequently explicit, obscene, violent, and bizarre, though, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot to joke about and improvise along the way?
Yes.
Oh.
So come for the mythology and stay for the absurdity on Myth Understood.
Available now at mythunderstoodpodcast.com and your podcast platform of choice.
It's Myth Understood.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers. We're excited to have you back. And remember, I always want to thank all of you listeners for inviting me into your space, whatever that space may be, wherever it is and whenever it is that you listen to these episodes. Real excited to welcome back our friend of the program and I think the record holder for most appearances on Don't Quill the Messenger. Dr. Earl Showerman is back with me today. And one of the reasons that I am so thrilled about this episode that you're about to listen to, ladies and gentlemen, is for the last several years, I have been begging this man to research this play and to prepare some materials on its background, its sources, and some of its hidden meanings. And finally, after years of urging and encouraging and prodding and actually just being a hindrance to him whenever I could, Dr. Earl Showerman is here to talk about Titus Andronicus. Yes, here we are. Titus, the bloody drama. Welcome, Earl. Welcome back.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And Stephen's honestly telling you the truth because it's been over 3 years that every time we see each other, he puts his finger on my chest and says, Titus. And a year ago, when we were working together during the fall symposium down in Napa, where Ben August lives, and we had a chance to see his copy of Herodotus, which had previously been owned by the 17th Earl of Oxford, that I actually took the message completely to heart because I knew there was a connection between Titus and Herodotus, but it took the combined energies of Ben August and you, Stephen, to force me into doing it. And I want to thank you, sir, for the privilege of having actually studied a play that I actually had refused to go to during the years that it had been in production at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, partly because as an emergency physician, I take personally the kind of violence that you see in this play, and this tragedy of blood is really exceeds all expectations and understandings of what's appropriate for the stage. However, it was a wonderful odyssey this past summer, and I'm researching it and coming up with a presentation. And for those of you that are familiar with the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, there is a 30-minute presentation I gave during our fall symposium this year on Titus Andronicus. You can go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, check out conferences, and past conferences is where you can get to the YouTube channel, and you can see some of the slides that I am unable to project today. But again, Stephen, thank you so much because it provided an incredible excursion into the history of this play and the literary sources of it is just a marvel.
Well, throughout your history as an Oxfordian, Earl, and I think definitely throughout the history of this podcast series, a great number of the episodes that you have been my guest for have revolved and surrounded about the Greek masters, and you're really known as the Greek specialist among the Oxfordian movement. And I always nickname you Aristotle, in fact, because not only are you so well versed in the Greek masters, but I also consider you to be a mentor of sorts, and Aristotle was one of the greatest mentors in the history of man, obviously mentor to Alexander the Great, and maybe Alexander wouldn't have been so great if he hadn't had Aristotle in his back pocket.
Well, he had Aristotle's back pocket, but he had Diogenes on stage with him. So I take a cross between Diogenes, the humorous cynic that actually was in John Lilly's play Campaspe, which is about Alexander the Great. So there is a connection there, but clearly I have been stimulated and enjoyed very much my work and my readings of Greek sources within Shakespeare. And really, fundamentally, the question of literary sources is what's really behind the whole authorship question in the first place. I know people like Alexander Waugh and Dorothea Dickerman have theories that involved various elements of historical connections and relationships and, possible illegitimate sons. However, my primary interest is in literary sources and in the fact that this extends far beyond what we would expect a person from Stratford-upon-Avon to have achieved in terms of a literary life. Stuart Gillespie, who's published a book on Shakespeare's sources, has mentioned over 200 titles that Shakespeare was likely to have relied on. But in terms of Greek sources, it's been really an uncultivated field for almost a century, since Robert Root said that no way did Shakespeare use Greek drama in his conception of mythology. And that hard line against Greek drama being an influence on Shakespeare extended throughout the 20th century. And only now in the last 5 or 10 years have you seen scholars seriously take on the questions of Shakespeare's knowledge of Euripides, let alone Sophocles and Aeschylus. So I think it's a very hot topic, and I was very fortunate at the outset of my studies in this area to have heard a man named Andrew Worth, who at the time was an undergraduate at Concordia University, give a presentation in 2002 at Concordia University on the question of Shakespeare's less Greek, which he phrased ironically, and pointed out this disparity, this cognitive dissonance, or he called it schizophrenic scholarship, on the fact
I like that. That's a great term. Schizophrenic scholarship.
I mean, it was a brilliant presentation pointing out how Shakespeare employed Greek words, invented words that were based on Greek roots, that he used Greek characters, of course, character names throughout the canon, largely from Plutarch's Lives, but also that there's references to various plays that a number of scholars, a scattering of scholars, have noted over the last 100 years. And he points out that this is a great area of exploration. And so when I began my own studies back in 2003, I was stimulated by Andrew's ideas and started off with Hamlet, and that was a very natural way to begin because there's a lot of Greek elements within Hamlet. But I will have to tell you, Stephen, as far as a classical sourced play is concerned, as Jonathan Bates said, that this play, Titus Andronicus, is beautified by the feathers of classicism and with a vengeance, he says.
Absolutely. I fully agree. And that's one of the reasons why for so many years I've encouraged you to dive deep into this play. I have always seen this play as a young Oxford bragging about his knowledge of the Greeks through this play. I see it as his homage to the Greek tragedy, which is why it's so bloody and so violent. He tries to outdo the masters in this play. And I think there's a certain amount of his ego in there. There's a certain amount of his pretentiousness in there, but also a tremendous amount of his mastery of those sources and being able to lace them into the text. And if I may be wrong, but I believe this play has more references in it than any other work of Shakespeare.
You're absolutely right, Stephen. It is a self-consciously literate play that really, you could call it competitive emulation. That is to say, he's overdoing what Kyd did. I mean, he's got twice as many deaths in Titus as there is in the Spanish tragedy, let alone Hamlet or Macbeth. I mean, it is a blood feast of the first order, but it involves both Latin and Greek elements. He's giving a tip of the hat to every one of the great writers. I mean, of the Latin writers, of course, Ovid had the most powerful impact on this play. He actually brings a copy of the Metamorphoses out in Act 3 as
yes.
Lavinia's trying to explain how she got mutilated and raped, and using actually a copy of the play as a prop on the stage. So I think Stephen Jonathan Bate mentioned 14 different references to the Tereus Procne Philomela story where, Tereus rapes his wife's sister and then cuts out her tongue, and then she sews a description of what happened to her. Her sister sees this. They kill Tereus' son, Procne's own son, and then feed it to him in a pie. So the elements of cannibalism and revenge by maternal outrage and the rape and mutilation comes straight out of Ovid, and just supernumerary number of references, let alone talking about Hecuba and Priam and Pyramus and Thisbe and Solon and all the other stories that come out of the Ovidian tradition. And when you date this play to 1594, which we know was the date that it was first performed, at least we have a record of it in January. And in June of that year at Newington Butts, it was performed along with a play called Hamlet and Taming of a Shrew. So it has a primary place as being among the first plays to have acknowledged to have been played, and also it was published that same year. And it is noteworthy that the Earl of Derby, Earl of Sussex, and Earl of Pembroke's players collaborated, because it's a big cast play, of course.
Yes, it is.
And all of those earls have connections to the Earl of Oxford. So it's very, very interesting. The next year, the Earl of Derby's will marry the Earl of Oxford's daughter, Elizabeth. So there was a close connection there. So it was the first play to ever been, first quarto ever to have been published, anonymously, of course. And we only actually have one copy of that quarto, as well as only one copy of the first quarto of Hamlet. So we're so fortunate to have had this literary evidence of early production and using as obviously a court production with nobility connected directly to the Earl of Oxford.
And it is indeed, it's a grand scale production. I've produced and directed the show 3 different times, and it's a large piece of theater, and it's very what the French would call later on to be invented a grand guignol in its nature. And those of you who aren't familiar with that term, I encourage you, go Google that and look that up. I think you'll enjoy doing a little bit of deep diving into grand guignol. But it's definitely has those giant over the top elements that you find in Greek tragedy.
Right.
And I think that I think Oxford loved this play. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see it performed with Hamlet and Taming of a Shrew. I think that's one of the reasons why you see it so early in the performance record. And the reason why it has continued to live the way that it has, not only just because we love the salaciousness of the bloodiness and the sex and violence in it, but I think that underneath all of that, you find some tremendous and beautiful messages. And the play makes me weep every time that I see it. It's a beautiful, beautiful play that's decorated with this blood and gore.
Well, let me just recommend to Quillers who are curious about this. I mean, as a read, it's excellent in terms of looking at all the classical references, and I'll lay out a few of those for you. But it was very popular in its day. Bartholomew Fair, published in 1616 by Ben Jonson, mentions that it had been 25 or 30 years since Andronicus and Hieronymo had graced the stage, and they were still quite popular. So we know that it was probably written in the late 1580s, maybe 1591. And so we know it was a very early play, but I think your favorite word, vainglorious, is a good description of the author's intention here, because he's laying on not only thick Ovidian influences, but he has direct quotes from several of Seneca's plays. The cannibalistic story where Titus cooks up a pie made from the bones and marrow of Tamara's 2 sons comes right out of that tradition as well. But it has Senecan influence and direct quotes from Hippolytus. The Thyestes is always referred to. You have Virgilian influence. You have Titus Livius work and being referenced there. You have so many Latin sources also that are obviously part of the play. Horace's odes are quoted directly. You have historians and poets, orators, playwrights, all sorts of Latin influence. On the Greek side, the primary influence that I want to talk about today is Herodotus, but also most of the names come of the characters come right out of Plutarch's Lives. The life of Livius Africanus, whatever it is. Almost all the players their names come right from one of the books of the Plutarch's Lives. The titled character, Titus Andronicus, is an invented name. But Titus Livius and Livius Andronicus kind of tied together. And Titus Livius is the name of Livy, the historian, whose story of Virgilius justifying the murder of his daughter after she's been raped is directly quoted for Titus's justification for murdering Lavinia at the very end of the play. So you have these wonderful crazy references that come right out of the Latin as well as the Greek tradition. But the other Greek people besides Plutarch we have is the Heliodorus story, the Ethiopica. It has the story of an Ethiopian or an African queen who has a fair-skinned child who she wants to cast off. Very similar to what Tamara is doing when she has a child by the Moor Aaron, which is obviously a very dark-skinned child that she has to eliminate. But both that story, that part of it comes probably right out of Heliodorus. And then the Greek historian Herodian, tells the story of the emperor Bassianus, otherwise known as Caracalla, who ruled during a time when there was a question of primogeniture versus other means of which you choose the emperor. And another character in that description of Herodian is a guy named Saturninus, who was an assassin sent to kill Bassianus. And of course, they're the brothers represented who are vying for power in there. So. But the most interesting name development that I think in the entire play is the role of Tamara, who's based on the Massagetae queen Thamyreus. And this is described in Herodotus' Book 1, the final part of Book 1, which is just a fabulous read. And this is a story of how Cyrus came to the Caspian Sea and was trying to conquer the land of the Massagetae, where Queen Thamyreus ruled. Thamyreus is actually how her name is pronounced, Thamyreus. Cyrus advanced an army. They were initially pushed back, and then they left a bunch of wine jugs around in their camp and food. And when the Massagetae army arrived, they started drinking the wine and got terribly drunk. They were used to smoking hashish and eating cultivated mare's milk. So their intoxicants of preference were different from those of the Persians. And then the Persians came back and captured the Massagetae army, executing virtually the entire army, and then holding Thamyreus' son in captivity. Well, she was outraged by this and challenged him to another battle. And prior to that, her son was released and committed suicide. So she had every reason to want to kill Cyrus, who was responsible for her own son's death. And so when she captured him and the army was destroyed, 200,000 Persians reportedly died in that battle. She had Cyrus's head cut off and dipped in a bucket of blood. So the idea of beheading and maternal revenge against a tyrant is echoed in both the story of Queen Thamyreus and Queen Tamara of the Goths. And the Massagetae were the ancestors of the Geats, otherwise known as the Goths. So you have a very clever arrangement where this one character is a historical character that's well described in Herodotus and a number of other volumes also. Now, the Persian influence on this, and of course the whole first book of Herodotus is about the development of the Persian Empire, which Cyrus basically founded, is that there was a queen Semiramis who was compared to Tamara twice, first by Aaron in a way that's very complimentary, and then is an insult because she had
Lavinia, right?
By Lavinia,
Lavinia
right.
brings
so there's two references to Semiramis. Well, Semiramis and Thamyreus were both elevated to become among the 9 worthies of women in the Middle Ages. So there were a number of references, literary references to these two marvelous women who were masters of warfare. Both of them were known for their capacities in battle and the difficulties that go with being a female ruler during that time. So Tamara is based on her character, and her name even is seemingly related to this wonderful queen that's described in Herodotus that was very heroic and was well known. Now, Shakespeare does make one reference to Thamyreus, that is in 1 Henry VI, and it's the Countess of Auvergne, who's waiting for arrival of a man she plans to capture, Talbot. And she says, if I can capture him, I will be like Thamyreus. She will trap him. And the question is, in that position, Thamyreus is referred to as the queen of the Scythians. Now, the Massagetae were related culturally to the Scythians, but they were a distinct tribe. Well, if you look at possibly where Shakespeare, Oxford, would have appreciated the fact that this is a Scythian queen, it comes right out of Trogaeus Pompeius, Justin's translation of Trogus, that was then translated by Arthur Golding and dedicated to the Earl of Oxford. And the whole first book of Trogus, which can be obtained online, I have a 17th century edition of Trogus. It wasn't Golding's translation, but it's one very similar to it, describes Tamraeus as a Scythian queen and gives the same description regarding her capture of Cyrus and his beheading and
so this
her
is
triumph.
a long list of very specific, very ancient literary references.
Yes.
And you immediately just now connected the Earl of Oxford to multiple volumes there, not only books that we know he particularly owned, and as we mentioned at the top of the program, one that Ben August holds in his own collection now,
Right.
that Herodotus, and with the Oxford emblem on the book. Right? Like, so we know for a fact that was his book because it's stamped right there on the cover. Then you mentioned Trogus and Justin
Yes.
and Golding, Arthur Golding, who is Oxford's uncle, who was also the translator of Ovid's Metamorphosis, which you've also mentioned.
Right.
And so these are books that have been translated by Oxford's maternal uncle, the brother to his mother. And we have a direct connection to the Earl of Oxford to these literary sources.
Yes.
What we don't have
wait,
is
wait.
any direct connection to these literary sources to the guy from Stratford who was dealing in grain and property at the time that all this was happening.
Well, we do know that there was a translation of Trogus dedicated to the Earl of Oxford, and in the dedicatory epistle, he talks about how important it is to understand the classics and in your education, that you need to study the classics, and this will make you a better person and a more noble, increase your nobility and your importance. But there's a third translation that Arthur Golding did. Now, in 1563, he did a translation of the history of the war between the Romans and the Goths for the occupation of Italy, and dedicated that to William Cecil, the Earl of Oxford's, mentor at that time and patron, So it was like, what? So in between 1563 and 1565, Arthur Golding, while sharing a residence with the Earl of Oxford at Cecil House on the Strand in London, translated 3 editions, all of which contributed to the conceptions that are represented in Titus Andronicus, Stephen. It felt like a revelation to me when I realized that these collaborative translation sources were all linked up within a very narrow period of time, during which time Golding and Oxford were basically seeing each other on a daily basis.
I told you there was a gold mine in this play to be found, and I'm so glad you finally picked up your pick and shovel and delivered these nuggets to us.
Well, it's hard to see through the blood sometimes, Stephen. You start off in Act 1, and you want to talk about the Greek elements and the Greek tragical qualities to this, and the Greek sources besides Plutarch and Heliodorus. We have probably allusions to Euripides' Hecuba, because when Lucius demands that Alarbus, Tamra's eldest son, be sacrificed, it is the first move that results in a Greek tragical complex. Okay. The sacrifice, the inappropriate sacrifice he calls him the proudest. He's sacrificing the proudest, it turns out to be Tamra's eldest son, and has him dismembered and then smeared blood and burn his guts and everything in honor to the dead Androniki. This is a very bad idea. The Greeks suffered a lot after the Trojan War, and one of the great sins they committed was the sacrifice of Polyxena to satisfy the ghost of Achilles. The youngest daughter of Priam and Hecuba was murdered on the demand of the ghost. And so this is a similar setup where the ghosts have to be mollified only by the blood of the proudest of the Goths. And Marcus Andronicus, earlier on, describing the war that Titus had suffered and the loss of 21 sons. Of course, Titus has 25 sons. Priam has 50. Okay, so he's a step down from Priam as in his awesomeness, but he still sacrifices a lot of bodies. But he says he's already sacrificed the noblest of the Goths, had already been offered in a sacrifice to the gods. He'd done what the correct response was to the situation. So this is over the top. It's about the proudest. It's about Lucius's demand for vengeance, and it starts the whole ball. Now, I want to just address just briefly here the idea that George Peele wrote the whole first act, first 650 line act scene in Titus Andronicus. That act has two of the best speeches in it, Stephen. I'm sure you will confirm that Tamara's speech for mercy, so that Alarbus
on her knees, begging for the life of her son.
And we even have an image of that from Henry Peacham. There was actually an illustration of the scene. It's the only illustration from all of Shakespeare's plays that is extant. Now, I think it came through John Payne Collier, so it's got some patina of fraud, but it may be an actual image that Peacham wrote. It is, because it includes text from the play that he copied, obviously, and put it into this illustration, which is dated from the 1590s. But it shows Tamara on her knee praying to Titus, who's in a Roman garb, and then there's Aaron holding a sword over the heads of Quintus and Marcius, Titus's two sons. So it's a very clear illustration of the dramaturgy. But that speech, I think, is like Portia's speech of quality of mercy is not strained. She really touches on some beautiful themes there. And then at the very end of that Act 1 is Aaron's soliloquy about the evils he plans on perpetrating.
Yes.
So I can't imagine, and all the allusions, all the classical references are set up in that. All the dramatic elements of this play are set up in that first act. I cannot believe that George Peele wrote that act and then Shakespeare took over the rest of the play. I just don't see any change in theme or language or anything that computer analyses and algorithms seem to suggest to some Shakespeare scholars. Not all, but Brian Vickers, McDonald Jackson, others seem to agree that Peele wrote that first act. I don't believe it. I don't
believe it either. And I think that there's another layer to this play that we'll touch on in a few moments that bespeaks the fact that there is a greater message underneath the dressing of the Greek tragedy and the vaingloriousness of showing off that I have all this literary knowledge and I've read all of these books, most of them in Latin. And, having access to that library is unspeakably difficult in this time period as well. And I think that, but underneath there is another message that we'll touch on in a few moments as you continue to spell out these allusions. And it has to also do with some of the names of some of the characters.
I agree, Stephen. I think that, so let's talk a little bit more about those burial rites. The maimed burial rites are critical. It's certainly in Sophoclean tragedy. You see this in certainly in Ajax, and you see it in Antigone.
Oh, Antigone, it's huge. It's the whole central focus of the entire play. And look how she ends up meeting her doom, too, right? Entombed in a cave.
So main burial rites central to Greek tragedy, and you see the challenge of that even in the first act. Not only after the inappropriate dismemberment and sacrifice of Alarbus, but the murder of Titus's own son Mutius for defending Bassianus and Lavinia's right to marry, since they were betrothed before that act began, but against Titus's will. And so he kills his own son, which is a horrible act, and it really turned me off. I think the first time I watched Julie Taymor's video of this, I stopped watching it right after that. I just can't take it. The father would kill his son over this. This is ridiculous. And then to make matters worse in terms of the Greek elements of this, he argues against the proper burial of his own son Mutius, who was arguing against Titus's position, but still an honorable defense of his sister and her betrothed. So that's another element. And of course you have Titus's... But
a traitorous act against the ruler. And so there's another little message in there. If you see this as the queen being part of the audience here, here's this message to the authoritarian ruler that it is not excusable, regardless of what the relationship is, to be a traitor to the queen, or to be, in this case, a traitor to the emperor, right?
Right. Well, it triggers the Saturninus's rejection of Titus and all the Andronici, and basically at that point, the whole plot is turning against them for the next couple of acts, and in which both of Titus's sons will fall into that swallowing pit, that horrible burial pit in the middle of Act 2, and then be accused and set up for a murder and be beheaded. So it really sets in motion the whole problem that goes forward. And really, Titus himself and Lavinia do experience proper burial at the end of it, but not Aaron. He's buried alive, and not Tamara. She's left to die, and after she's been murdered, and then be fed on the birds and the prey out there. So the continuation of violation of burial rights continues through this play right up to the very end. So that's another Greek element. You have Titus's insanity, whether it's feigned or real. It is distracted state of mind is very relevant to a Greek drama. The idea of dismemberment and cannibalism that comes right out of the Greek tradition, and of course you have the incredible set of literary allusions that we've been kind of hinting at throughout this whole play. So there is a scene in Sophocles' Ajax in which Ulysses argues for proper burial for Ajax, even though he's committed suicide, because he was a noble warrior and fought for 10 years in the Greek cause in the war. And that's alluded to also in Marcus's challenge to Titus to allow his son Mutius to be buried nobly. So right away in that first act, you've got all these allusions to Greek drama, to thick Ovidian influences and classical allusions just peppered throughout this play at an incredible concentration. And I think you're absolutely right about this. But you read the criticisms of this play from modern editors, any 20th century editors. T.S. Eliot, thought it was just a terrible play, the worst, the stupidest thing he'd ever seen. Dover Wilson would.
That surprises me that Eliot, who was seen very much as a Catholic apologist, would fail to find some of the allegorical messages in this play. And that's some of the things I want to talk about in a minute. But this play has so much religion in it.
It does.
And it surprises me that Eliot would condemn it the way that he did and miss some of that subtext.
Absolutely right. I mean, the cocktail party is based on Euripides' Alcestis. It's almost a reinvention of that whole plot. Plus, Eliot edited the Seneca's 10 tragedies. So he's the editor in the early 20th century of a collection of Seneca's tragedies. So he obviously had some interest in Senecan tragedies. So I think it just touched him a little bit too deeply. But I think Jonathan Bate is right. Then it's really a classical exercise in dense classicism, and it's a show-off piece of a young playwright who's just kind of gaining his ground and out murdering everybody else. I mean,
I will out murder you.
That's right. I will. Well, you have Mutius and Marcius and Chiron and Demetrius will be murdered near the end of the play. Yes. The two sons of Tamara, they'll be hung upside down and blood let out while Lavinia collects their blood in a basin to make that pie that
great scene
Titus is going to feed to Tamara and Saturninus. And then, of course, in the final act of the play, you have Titus, quoting Livy to justify his murder of Lavinia to relieve her of her suffering, I think is the primary idea here.
Oh, that's one of the moments between the moment when Marcus discovers Lavinia, and that's one of the great monologues in the entire play, I believe, is Marcus's discovery of Lavinia and the speech that he delivers there, and then takes her in his arm and says, let's bring you to your father so that his heart can break at this. Yeah. And then Titus's reaction to it is so wonderful and so beautiful, to spare her the shame, because he sees, like, he's crushed, right? He's dying inside, but he tries to reduce her pain by concealing his own and making as light of it as he can. Yeah. And then that final moment where he takes her in her arms, she's had her revenge. She's seen the deaths of her perpetrators. She's seen the revenge upon Tamara, who pitted them to it. Right. And now she has no further reason to live. And he spares her any further pain by ending her life, taking her into his arms and then snapping her neck. It is just tremendous, those moments in that play.
Well, and then to be followed immediately by his slaughter of Tamara, and then Saturninus kills Titus, and then Lucius, and this is a matter of 5 or 6 lines, okay? Yes, right. And then Lucius kills,
you die. No, you die. No, you. No, you.
Yeah. And so Lucius now is going to be the emperor, and then he orders the live burial of Aaron at the very end. And Aaron's comments at the very end, if I have anything to repent, it's that I didn't do enough evil deeds in the world, and talk about maimed burial rites. He related that he would dig up corpses and put them by the house houses of their friends and family members and put signs on them, said, "Don't forget me, don't forget me." So he talk about violating burial rites. Aaron was the best at that. So we have so many elements of Greek drama in here, but that whole bloody scene at the very end is a real turnoff. But I do recommend Julie Taymor's video that's about 20 years old now with Anthony Hopkins playing Titus. I was reluctant to watch that through, and finally I said, wow, they really did a good job. It's done kind of symbolically and
it's very
with
Taymor.
pageant.
It's
very
very,
Taymor.
very
It's
Taymor.
pageant-wise,
Yeah,
but-
she's very broad. She's Broadway director turned
Yes.
film director, and everything is grand scale and very production oriented. Some of the things that I dislike about the film is there's all this insertion of choreography and things at the sacrifice of the text, and that I always disagree with that when they make a film out of Shakespeare's plays. But it is star-studded with fantastic performances, and some of them younger actors at the time who then go on to have even more fantastic careers.
Yes.
Jonathan Rhys Meyers, for instance, is one of the sons. He's so young. He's like 12 years old. He looks like 12 years old in that movie because he's so young. And then he goes on to play Henry in the Tudors, and recently was in another fictional history series that I'm missing right now in my head. But yeah, great actor.
Jessica Lange, of course,
she
is
does a
Tamara.
magnificent job.
Yeah.
You mentioned the lead,
Anthony Hopkins.
and then I'm drawing a blank on Saturninus, the Broadway actor who also plays Nightcrawler in the X-Men series, and also a huge Broadway star with several Tony Awards to his name, and it's escaping me. I'll be getting emails from Quillers now with the answer.
Well, I do recommend another video version, however, that was produced about 5 years ago. It's the Globe on Stage. So it's the Globe production in London, England, in the New Globe, done very realistically and incredibly powerfully by a cast from the Globe Company. So I can't name you the performers in that, but it was a compelling production, and I highly recommend that one in particular.
I will look for it.
Yeah, I actually have a copy I can loan you someday. So if you're suited up for some bloody gore, yeah, I'm glad to provide it. But the horrific aspects of this are dealt with very, very well in this one, and you do get a powerful feeling for how the play was originally produced in that production. I think that it does show the big cast, but it's not overwhelming, and it is on one stage at 3 levels. So it's really an extra. I mean, the amount of stage direction in this play, it exceeds, I think, most plays by quite a bit because of the large movements of characters between various levels and the size of the cast itself.
It's true, but it doesn't have the most famous stage direction.
Exit chased by a bear.
Exits pursued by a bear.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, and that's a bloody scene, right? Is he gonna he gets eaten by the bear
Off stage.
That's not good.
In the Greek manner, done off stage.
In a very Greek manner. That is
Okay.
correct. And that is something about Titus that is interesting, is that some of the violence, not all of the violence, but some of the violence actually occurs on the stage.
Right.
And including the severing of Titus's hand, which, P.S., is a very difficult scene to do realistically, especially in a small theater setting. Trust me, I know for a fact.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, and that has more of a Senecan quality to it than it does some of the traditional Greek drama that would almost always have the murdering done off stage, particularly like in the Oresteia, where Agamemnon and Clytemnestra and Aegisthus and Cassandra, they're all slaughtered off stage, but then their bodies are brought out onto the center of the stage using what the Greeks called the ekiklema. It's kind of like a wheelbarrow. Then you put the dead bodies in there and wheel them forward, and that was how those deaths were perceived.
Macduff murders Macbeth and severs his head off stage, and
Right.
then brings his head back onto the stage in Macbeth, for
Right.
instance, is a great example.
And of course, Duncan is slaughtered off stage. So only Banquo is slaughtered on stage as well. Well, Macduff's children and wife are chased off stage too. They could be considered murdered on stage. But the murder of Banquo on stage at the Oregon Shakespeare production in 2009 horrified me. They wrestled the actor, Rex was the actor, oh my gosh, to the front of the stage, and then they slashed his neck. Excuse me, Jake, for tapping that. They slashed his neck, and they had a pressurized compartment with bloody fluid that spurted out of his neck, and it made my hair stand on end.
That's fabulous. So when I have produced Titus Andronicus, it's one of the plays that I have actually conceptualized when I have produced it, and I've done a Gothic vampire version of it. And all you have to do in order to make that work is change all the references to the sun to the moon instead. And what you get is this, these savage vampire Romans who absorb and convert these Goths to their ways, teach them their bloody violence, and it comes back to bite them, pardon the pun. Rome is full of tigers, and tigers must feed is one of the lines, and it works so well when these people bare their fangs and use these stakes to murder each other. And we used blood bags, and we had to have, in my theater in LA, we had to issue garbage bags to the first 2 rows because there was a splash zone, because the blood would squirt out into the audience. And it was awesome. We would talk about a great production and people just eating that up like candy.
Oh, well, here's the thing. It borders on parody, Stephen. I mean,
it
really,
does.
You have black comedy elements that seem directly derived from Terence, okay? Terence was a black man, probably. He was a slave from Carthage and then taken to Rome by one of the senators as benefactor, who was then freed, and he continued to write. But he very well could be a black person, one of the first knowledge that we know of black writers in the classical era. But his type of humor is very much embedded in this. I mean, the whole idea that the daughter and the fiancé would run off and try and avoid the father's judgment about getting married. Usually it ended up as a comedy plot in Roman comedy, but that obviously ends up very tragically for both Bassianus and Lavinia and Saturninus in the story. So there's black comedy woven in. I mean, it borders on satire, really, as much blood as you have there. It's like I said, double the volumes of people dying that you have in almost every other revenge tragedy of that era, including Macbeth and
in that
Hamlet.
day, they would have used pig's blood and pig's bladders filled with blood in order to simulate that bloodiness. And you can imagine that the penny seats, down the groundlings down up against the stage would have just loved all of that. And they probably did react in some ways more to like a dark comedy rather than understanding all of the literary references. Most of them couldn't read. Only 1 in 10 people in London at the time could read. And so, of course, that's part of what the beauty of Shakespeare is, though, right? Is he appeals to every level of society with his writing. So the blood and the guts may have been to the benefit of the penny seats and the uneducated, whereas up in the upper levels, they were understanding these Greek references and they were understanding these elements of the symbolism of the story, as well as some of the political messages that you find there, such as you're a traitor if you go against the will of your sovereign leader, that type of thing.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Dover Wilson said this, that he thought of Titus as a huge joke, tossing gobbets of sob stuff and raw beefsteak to the mob. So you're right about that, but I do think that it has several layers of meaning. And in fact, it gets extremely subtle. For instance, you have 4 or 5 Latin quotations within it, Terras, Astraea, reliquit, Astraea has abandoned us. Now, what that references to, and that's what Titus says to Marcus after Lavinia's been mutilated and raped, and the sons' heads have been cut off, and he says that the world is upside down, that we're now in a situation where we don't have the goddess of justice, Astraea. And Astraea was associated, of course, with Queen Elizabeth, and a lot of the iconography of that period. She had a strong association with Astraea. And the irony, of course, is built into this, because in response to the absence of Astraea, Titus organizes search parties to find her. They look in the sea. They send people out onto the ocean to go find her in some kind of fishing net. Go find Australia. She's in the ocean. No, maybe she's underground. So we'll send a crew to dig down deep underground, down to Hades and find Australia there. Or maybe she's way up in the heavens, so we'll shoot arrows up into the heavens. Well, the Iron Age is when Australia left humanity, according to Ovid's Metamorphoses. And that the corruption in human culture that occurred during that fifth phase, that's after the gold and silver, bronze age, and now the Iron Age, is that the human relationships are in decline, that there's no trust anymore, that there's violence and injustices throughout the world, that's the characteristics of this Iron Age, that the return of the Golden Age is what they aspire to. Well, Titus's strategies to find her by seafaring and mining, those are two of the things that Ovid identifies as being particularly heinous about that fifth age, the Iron Age. So it's very interesting that not only is he quoting something that suggests that an Ovidian context, but the irony of what he's proposing and what he's dispatching crews to do goes exactly against the Ovidian description of what is wrong with humanity during this period. That seafaring and mining and these commercial enterprises are what's causing human corruption. And then he has another quote, another long Latin quote that he sends in the messages with the weapons to Chiron and Demetrius, the sons of Tamara, who are, bound to be slaughtered at the end of this. And a long Latin quote. And Chiron says, "Oh, I understood. I read it in my book while I was in grammar school." And it's a quote from Horace that translates as the upright man who lives in justice does not require the bow or arrow of the Moor. Okay? So it's showing that Titus understands that these men are operating under the guidance of Aaron the Moor, okay, and that they committed murder and rape, okay, and so the Latin translation that he's saying, "Oh, I understand this," he clearly doesn't understand it, and Aaron calls him, what it is to be an ass,
right?
And even young Lucius,
Aaron does understand it.
Aaron understands it, and young Lucius interprets, "Oh, we've been deciphered. We know what you did to Lavinia here," but Chiron and Demetrius are completely oblivious to the meaning of that. So Shakespeare is taking you to a point of where an ignorant character pretends that he actually knows something that he doesn't, and he points it out to us, and that certain characters on the stage already understand that. So there's a built-in irony oftentimes with these Latin tags that he integrates into the text. So it's very subtle. It really is a marvelous excursion into sometimes deep irony and deep satire in relation with some of these classical sources.
Well, and very astute Oxfordians will also note, when you mentioned seafaring and mining, that these were two things that were of very important interest to the Earl of Oxford. He writes to the Queen how many times in seeking the monopoly on the tin trade,
yes,
which is mining.
Yes.
And he wants to go to sea either in battle or to explore the continent. And in both cases, she refuses, finally allowing him to go explore the continent by ship. And then, of course, that's on his way back when we discover the pirates. You know me, and I love the pirates.
Oh, love the pirates.
But so I think it's interesting that you know, that's an ironic little element in there as well.
It is. It shows the author's subtlety and his irony and his amusement at the confusion of the characters on stage and the confusion among the groundlings, because the people who really know their Ovid would recognize immediately that the fifth age of the Iron Age is described in Ovid in a way that is obviously contrary to what Titus is embarking on and trying to solve the question, how can we bring justice back into the world? Well, justice will not enter the world in this play. It is a bloodbath in the end, and of the most egregious sort. So, yeah.
I think that touches on the area of messaging in the play that I want to go to next, and that is that I believe that there is a large subtext in this play that has to do with, as you say, justice and the forms of Old Testament justice as opposed to New Testament forgiveness and redemption. It's a giant theme through this play, the sacrificing of sons. And it's interesting to me that Titus was the emperor of Rome who conquered Judea, and Lucius was the first Christian king of England.
Yes. Well, and then you have the references to Lucrece, and it's Lucius Junius Brutus, who drove out the Tarquins,
Right.
Okay, in revenge for the rape of Lucrece. There's 3 references, incidentally, to Lucrece, which was also published the same year that Titus Andronicus was published. So the Ovidian influence on the lyrical poems on Venus and Adonis and Lucrece and Titus is parallel. So these are kind of exercises using Ovidian narratives to expand, because Titus has no primary narrative source. There's no primary plot source. It's just a hodgepodge of narratives, and it's as original as Midsummer Night's Dream or The Tempest in terms of its underlying primary plot.
Well, and then you have the very curious name of Aaron the Moor.
Yes.
Aaron, bringer of light.
Yes.
Which is so ironic, right? And I know that the author is being as ironic as possible there, that he's going to name this Moor, this very dark character, very evil, wicked character, give him the name of Moses' right hand, Aaron, who is this bringer of light, bringer of messages. And what is the message that Aaron brings? The message that he continues to bring is that revenge is the wrong path. It is the incorrect way. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is the old way, and it leads to more bloodshed. Forgiveness and redemption is the new way. And at the very end of the play, Lucius turns that corner when he agrees to raise Aaron's son as his own. And finally, the sacrifices of sons come to an end.
Yes.
And I believe that that's a Christian message there that Shakespeare is inserting, that Lucius, this first Christian king who is now the emperor, learns from all of this past horror and bloodshed and death and turns the corner and accepts the New Testament message of redemption, forgiveness, turn the other cheek, and stop this sacrifice of sons, because the ultimate sacrifice of a son has already occurred, and that is Christ on the cross.
Well, I think that you definitely have a point there, and there's reference to a monastery and to other Christian concepts that it's definitely integrated into what otherwise is considered to be a Roman story. However, intergenerational murder, the murder of sons and daughters, is a Greek element also. It's foundational to the Oresteia. It's also represented in Iphigenia at Aulis, where the Iphigenia is sacrificed so that the Trojan War may proceed, and the sacrifice of Polyxena and Troy. So the idea of the children being murdered by the parents or the opposite also occurs. So that's another Greek element. But I also agree that there's deep Christian roots running through this, because the absence of a moral center in the entire play is represented. Now, Aaron is another possible source for that name, is that there was an Aaron who came from France, who was a Tuscan, I think, and led the Gauls in their invasion of Italy. And the reason for the invasion was they were trying to find out how and where they made wine and how to grab those wine vines and take them with them. That was a justification for that particular invasion of Italy, was to get vinage to take back to France with them.
Somewhere, I think it might be in Plutarch, but somewhere there's a story, I believe, of one of the great philosophers, and I can't recall now which one, standing before the Greek council, and he pulls out a pomegranate or a fig, and he holds it up in the air, and he uses that as his reason that they should invade Sicily. I think it's a pomegranate.
It might be. It certainly sounds like something Alcibiades would have done. He was all for war with Sicily.
Yeah, he reaches into his toga or his hamatia, because they're Greeks, they're not togas yet. He reaches into his robes. We'll just use robes. And he pulls out a pomegranate, and at the end of his speech, "This is why we must go to war," representing the resources that they would obtain by doing so. So, going after wine, that's not too far-fetched.
No, but of course that invasion of Sicily was a catastrophe for the Athenians. It was really the beginning of the downfall of the whole golden age of Athens. Their poor management of that, and their alienation of Alcibiades, who advised the Spartans, and eventually brought about the downfall of Athens over the next 10 years. Yes.
There is one element to Titus that I'm curious to see how you dealt with when you came across it and what you think about it. Each time that I've produced the show, I've actually cut this segment of the play, even though I do believe it's a crucially important part of the play, especially in the messages we were just talking about. But it doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't make any sense to a viewer when you watch it. And that is this messenger who shows up. He's referred to in some scripts as a clown.
Yes.
And he shows up to deliver the message to Saturninus about what is happening with Titus and the people that he is amassing against Saturninus, who the people have now turned against in popular opinion. And Saturninus murders the messenger.
He quills that messenger.
He quills that messenger.
He does.
He does. And the messenger invokes the name of Saint Stephen, the first Christian martyr, while he's being put to death for delivering the message. And it's this reflection of you deliver this message of Christ and redemption, and you pay for it, as we know that most of the apostles met terrible deaths, including Peter, who was crucified upside down, for instance. But here you have this messenger who invokes the name of Saint Stephen in this quote unquote classical Greek Roman play. How does that make any sense, except for that is the turning point of the play from Old Testament to New Testament in my mind?
Well, that's a beautiful way of considering it, Stephen. Certainly is the anagoresis, the reversal is about to occur. And the ridiculousness that Tamara goes as in the character of revenge, okay? And her sons go as murder and rape. And Titus says to them, my gosh, you look an awful lot like the Empress and her sons. Oh, no, we're not those people. We're here to serve you. I mean, the ludicrousness of that whole idea, Tamara's hubris and thinking she could get away with something like that. She is a wonderful caricature that suggests early vestiges of Lady Macbeth. She's got a lot of Lady Macbeth in her, but there's an ignorance of where things are toward the end of the play, where she assumes she still can convince Titus that she's been dissembling to him the whole play about how we're here to help you and support you and deal with the problems that you've been facing. And in fact, she's behind the whole plot to bring him down. But the idea that they would go in disguise of who they actually are, I mean, Shakespeare's just laughing. I mean, that is the most ludicrous scene, and of course, it's preceded by the final scenes of the execution of her sons in the most grisly fashion, and then the bloodbath at the very end.
In some ways, they're sort of putting on a mask. Right.
Yes.
And I don't mean mask in the sense that, yes, they are, according to the script, wearing masks, but I also mean mask in the sense of a form of presentation, as a form of performance that was very popular in Elizabethan times, right? So putting on masks was a very, similar thing to theatrical presentations, but not quite as involved and not as scripted, and usually had a lot more of dance elements and costume elements to them. So in a sense, they're putting on a mask for Titus in this presentation, this performance that they're doing for him.
Right, but in the gross irony of them portraying who they really are. That can't escape anybody that's in the theater. They've seen the whole thing go down. And so, deep irony is another Greek element. And here is Shakespeare flagrantly putting it right in front of everybody's face. And of course, Tamara, Chiron, and Demetrius, they all misinterpret it and don't realize their jeopardy and how they've been outed, even though they themselves are wearing the costumes which fit their particular roles within the play.
It's also the point in the play where, because you mentioned earlier about Titus's madness and whether it is real or feigned, which is a question that commonly comes up about Hamlet and his madness as well. And it's another thing that we see reflected also in King Lear, where his dementia seems to sort of come and go. And near the end of the play, he's extremely lucid. Once the storm has occurred and sort of the cloudiness has been symbolically washed away from him, he's very lucid and very connected. And he has to be, especially when he has the loss of Cordelia at the end, another heartbreaking moment in Shakespeare. But in Titus, this moment where Tamara and her sons show up as revenge, rapine, and murder, that's when we, the audience, get to see that Titus has turned that corner. That yes, the madness that he's been suffering may have been very real, based in grief, but now that his head is clear on what his plan is for revenge, he is pretending to remain mad, but is extremely lucid and direct and knows exactly what his plan is. When he says, "Oh, but leave raping and murder here with me." And she, like an idiot, does.
Right. That is her, her wound is that she can't see anymore. She's so inflated with her own powers, having risen from being, the queen in captivity and a slave to being the emperor's wife and the one who's manipulating this whole tragical scene. So I think you're absolutely right about that whole mask-like quality to that particular scene, and that it is a dissembled madness that ultimately, in the end, I mean, the feigned disposition, that Hamlet talks about, that is characteristic of a man who's very conniving and controlling. And of course, at the very end, when he serially kills his daughter and Tamara, I mean, all that is very clearly premeditated.
Yes, absolutely. One would say mad, but north by northwest. Right? I can still tell a hawk from a handsaw, as it were.
You did mention one thing that is another characteristic of Greek drama, and that is the question of the sun and your marvelous idea about creating a vampire-like culture and replacing the sun, the reference to the sun, with the moon, and creating this kind of bloodthirsty situation. Really worked for me the way you described it, Stephen. I think that's great. But the funny thing, the irony is that in most Greek drama, you do find a sun salutation, a prayer to the sun for beneficence. And in Timon of Athens, for instance, it's done. He says, "Oh, bring scurrilous, bring horrible weather, and all that." So Titus gives a salutation to them, which is completely negative. Well, it's left to Aaron. It's a very brief salutation of the sun that he's referencing the rise of Tamara, like a great sun rising above Rome. So that's another subtle element that he throws in there that's characteristic of Greek drama. So I have to give it to you, Stephen. I didn't see it until I delved down into this play and experienced it directly, that there is evidence for obviously a Greek, what you could call a palimpsest. So you have Roman.
Ooh, that's a big word.
Yeah.
A palimpsest.
The palimpsest. Palimpsests were documents that were overwritten. They were originally, then they would wash out that text and write another text on top of that. That is the description of a palimpsest. Well, Titus itself is a palimpsest, layering Greek, Roman, and Christian morals, narratives, metaphors, allusions, all through the entire text. So it's a polyglot of religious and influences from a variety of traditions, so that you could say they've overwritten upon each other. That amplifies the archetypal power that the play possesses. Hamlet does the same thing. There's a huge number of Latin allusions to Latin texts in Hamlet, as well as Greek allusions in Hamlet. So he's doing it in both these plays. And it's rather interesting that the first quarto of Hamlet, we don't know for sure that was the text of the first Hamlet productions that were referenced in 1589, but that would have been about the same year that you would have expected a production of Titus Andronicus for the first time.
Palimpsests and polyglots. It sounds like the album title of a punk rock band.
Yes, you don't still want to be named Omicron right now.
No,
there's a punk band in the Scandinavia named Omicron, and they're kind of embarrassed by the situation.
Oh, that'd be terrible. That's okay. I don't know how you deal with that. I don't know how you change your name. That's like the exercise bike company that just declined like 20% in its shares because some TV show had a character die of a heart attack after riding one of their exercise bikes. Like this is crazy, and this is the power. And it's kind of an interesting segue because this is the power of theater. This is the power of film, which is an extension of theater in many, many, many ways. It happened one night. Very famous film from the late 30s, early 40s, Clark Gable. And a choice was made in that film for him to not have an undershirt. And there was a very specific costuming reason for that. It wasn't a choice made for any other reason than a practical shooting the film reason. And the following year, men's underwear sales declined by 50%. That's a true fact. You can look that up. And it was all because the power of, well, if Clark Gable's not going to wear an undershirt, I don't need to wear an undershirt. And this is the power of what the celebrity can do and the power of what theater can do. Remember, it was the philosopher Solon who, when he first saw Thespis perform his monodrama as Dionysius, marched forward to the stage and struck his staff on the ground and said, "This cannot be. We cannot allow this. This is deception. You are convincing the common people that you are something that you are not, and they are going to believe it. And sooner or later, this is going to have an impact on every level of our society, including our politics. This cannot be."
Well, the Greeks, once again, had an incredible level of artistic freedom. That poetic license was something that was allowed in that democracy, but you had to be careful about it. For instance, if you criticized the Greeks who had fought at the Battle of Marathon in a play, you would be fined basically a year's salary. That did happen to Agathon, I think. But it reflects on the fact that you can write political drama, but you have to do it allegorically or symbolically on some level, that people can get the message without it being too direct and hammering you on your head. Now, in the comedies, they could get away with it. Aristophanes' comedies directly criticizes important personalities in Athens like Pericles or Socrates or Cleon, and directly naming them and making them characters out of them. So the Greek comedic tradition allowed that kind of thing. In fact, Cleon, who was the tyrant in Athens after the death of Pericles, sued Aristophanes and lost in court. Aristophanes could say whatever he wanted about Cleon, even though he was sitting right there in the front row. So the Greek tradition did include political commentary, but you had to be careful about how you did it, particularly in the tragedies.
And our guy masters that in Elizabethan England.
He certainly does.
Look at the Shakespeare plays and the canon and how many messages there are laced into each play, including this one that we're talking about in Titus, where I believe that every single play has at least one, if not hundreds of messages that are being delivered directly to the queen, to Burleigh, to the Privy Council, to members of the court. He lampoons many members of the court in many of his plays. He talks about very contemporary references and issues and political intrigue and scandal that is going on in the court at the time. All of that comes out just as the Greeks would have done. And I say that our guy was a lover of the Greek tradition. He was a master of the Greek classics, and this play is one of those like dots on the exclamation point for him. But that we see it, as you've pointed out in many episodes of this program, we see it again and again and again, this homage to the Greeks and the Greek sources and references and influences that we find in the Shakespeare canon.
I mean, he does something alchemical with the Greek narratives and integrates them beautifully. I mean, his primary artistic achievement in many ways was the mimetic qualities to it, that he could emulate Greek tradition and Greek narratives and Greek metaphors and all this and integrate them into a play like seamlessly. And for a literate audience, they would deeply appreciate that, but it might get lost on people who were not classically educated. That's certainly true, Stephen. And I do agree that he, after 2,000 years of no realistic drama, that Shakespeare is using those Greeks to foist himself forward and to use those narratives, use those metaphors and characterizations in ways that would bring a very realistic drama back to life for the first time in 2 millennia.
Well, and I want to encourage my listeners out there, all of you fellow Quillers. Some of you I know when you find this series, some of you, you'll write to me and you tell me you go back to the beginning and you start listening to them in order. And some of you I know you kind of bounce around and pick and choose topics and subjects that you're interested in and find episodes that you're interested in. Some of you find a guest that you particularly like and you go back and you find the episodes that guest has been on. And we've had several recurring guests. As I mentioned at the top of the program, I think Earl now holds the record. He and my wife, Annie, have been sort of in this battle over the 3 years of this program as to who has more episodes to their credit. But this one, I think, put you over the top, Earl. But I do want to encourage listeners, go back and find the other episodes that feature Earl. One particular one that comes to mind that it was one of my favorites was one that we did on Macbeth and the Greek influences and allusions that you can find in that play, which I think are astounding and I think will really intrigue you if you've been listening to this episode and you're really intrigued by this episode, you'll really love that one on Macbeth. It's surprising how much Greek you can find in that Scottish play, ironically.
And excited news, everybody. In just a couple of weeks, Joel Coen's directed version of Macbeth with Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand as the Macbeths will be in the theaters. So now is the time to go read my paper on Macbeth from 2011 in Brief Chronicles, or listen to our podcast description of that play, and then go see the play. I think you'll have your socks knocked off, and I've heard wonderful pre-reviews on that production.
I hope that's one that they're going to do where you can actually go to a movie theater and see a version of the live stage production that they've done so often with so many different wonderful Shakespeare productions. Annie and I have been to see several like that. Julius Caesar was one that we really enjoyed. Cumberbatch's Hamlet was one that we saw. Did not quite enjoy that one so much, but nonetheless, it was great to see. So I hope they're going to do that with this production of Macbeth as well.
Coen is directly connected, of course, to Mark Rylance, who was in at least one of his movies. And so Joel Coen actually made some commentaries on his use of literary sources during a program this past November, sponsored by the Shakespearean Authorship Trust of London. If you go to the Shakespearean Authorship Trust and look at their videos, you will see Joel Coen commenting a bit on his concept of in developing his production of Macbeth. So it's all a big, wonderful circle, and the Greeks keep bringing us back to those original archetypal themes that are so resonant and still active. One of the great theatrical productions going on right now in America is called The Theater of War, and it's sponsored by a man named Brian Dares, who just published a collection of the Theban trilogy, the Antigone and the two Oedipus plays. And Brian Dares does live readings, and they're available free on Zoom. And if you just Google The Theater of War, but he uses the Ajax and the Philoctetes of Sophocles to describe and help people process post-traumatic stress situations. And they have done these productions for many years on military bases, for veterans, for healthcare providers, and they are actively going on right now. So I just watched a 3-part production of those Theban plays over a weekend, and it's wonderful. These are professional actors doing the readings, and it's a wonderful way of becoming familiar again with some of those Greek dramas. So the Theater of War, I do recommend that.
And again, demonstrating the power of theater. And I think that our guy, Oxford, who we, of course, both believe is the true Shakespeare, the man behind the pseudonym, I think he understood that particularly well, and I think better than his contemporaries. I think that through him, Queen Elizabeth came to understand the power. I think that's one of the explanations for why there's that 1,000-pound annuity that eventually comes about, where she is paying him to be her propagandist, because she gets it. She understands the power of the play to move the masses and to send a direct message, especially to a populace that cannot read and therefore must absorb things visually. And that is obviously connected to 2,500 years of theatrical history.
Absolutely. Well, Elizabeth herself could read Greek. And under the guidance of Roger Ascham, who was her tutor, she actually translated one of Euripides' Iphigenia plays. We don't know which one it was, and the text no longer exists. But she was so knowledgeable in the Greeks that she could actually translate themselves. And let's say that the Earl of Oxford received Greek education from his original tutor, Thomas Smith. Smith was England's foremost Greek orator at that time, produced the plays of Aristophanes at Queen's College in Cambridge. He was then in Cecil House, where Mildred Cecil, his future mother-in-law, was an acknowledged Greek specialist, spoke and wrote Greek as fluently. She did English, according to other scholars. And then, of course, when he was on his travels in Italy, he went to the Greek church where the liturgy would have been in Greek. We know that he had purchased some Greek texts, and, of course, he bought the Italian translation of Herodotus. He had the French translation of Plutarch's Lives. He received the dedication of Heliodorus' Ethiopica. So from a literary source standpoint of view, an interest expressed throughout his life, Oxford would be a prime candidate for an author who had some interest and dependency on Greek drama as his primary sources. And again, Stephen, that is the foundation of authorship doubt from the get-go, that there's such a profusion of literary allusions and references within Shakespeare that it is impossible to think of someone who had a mere grammar school education to have achieved that, because these texts were not published in England. The Greek texts weren't. There was only a few plays that had been translated and published in England during Shakespeare's lifetime, whichever person you think wrote the works, and that they would have been continental Latin translations, parallel Greek Latin translations that were probably Shakespeare's primary sources, but they have been ignored by virtually all serious scholars in the 20th century. However, in the 21st century, Tanya Pollard, professor at Brooklyn College, New York.
I wondered when you were going to mention her. I don't know that you've ever done an episode in the last 4 or 5 that you have not at least mentioned her one time.
If you're listening, Tanya, you have my heart, because you have categorized and honestly taken a serious look and a very convincing discussion throughout your book, Greek tragic women on Shakespearean stages, that Euripides clearly directly influenced Shakespeare, which runs against the opinions of people like Jonathan Bate or Colin Burrow, who are acknowledged classic specialists in the field of Shakespeare studies. So she's leading the light in that direction, and I'm encouraging to communicate with her. We've corresponded some in the past, so if I can write this paper up on Titus, she will be getting a first copy of it.
Fantastic. That's great news. So that's what's next on your list of to-dos, is to write this all up and turn it into a scholarly piece?
This is what really we need to do. I mean, it's wonderful to have a podcast. It's wonderful to give a PowerPoint presentation, but you really need to drill down and create a credible, peer-reviewed article that describes the things that we're pointing at here, that there's this profusion of influence, and it's in the traditional scholarship. You just have to bend your vision a little bit sideways and see the importance of Arthur Golding's translations as primary sources here, and their deep connection to the Earl of Oxford and his life and his life interests.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And I'm so glad, Earl, that you finally relented and that you have embraced Titus wholeheartedly. I'm wondering now, what is it that I can encourage you to do next?
Well, let me just make one other mention here. In Brief Chronicles 1, 2009, Michael Delahoyd has a wonderful article that approaches more of a psychological interest in Titus Andronicus as an Earl of Oxford's production. And one of the images he comes up with and discusses that the Oxford's stifling of his name, the suppression of his name as being related to these works, is represented by Lavinia. Lavinia really, is named after the first, Aeneas's wife. She was the mother of Rome. Okay, Lavinia was the mother of Rome. So she's had both her hands cut off and her tongue cut out. So she's speechless and can't write other than to scrawl on sand and to implicate her accusers. Michael suggests that the image of Lavinia carrying Titus's hand in her mouth, walking off the stage while they're carrying the two heads of his other sons,
yes,
is an emblem of the situation that the Earl of Oxford in, who's forced to suppress his name as being connected to these works in any direct way.
That's interesting. I like that symbolism there too. I never thought of it from that perspective, but definitely there are a lot of little veiled things in this play that are connected to his circumstance. And I think that's one of the reasons why the play has such a giant message of this redemption and forgiveness aspect at the very end of it. In fact, I always thought it'd be good if there were a sequel to this play, Lucius Andronicus, and you learn what happens to Aaron's son as the stepson of Lucius growing up and what he becomes in his trials and tribulations. And does he go on to inherit the throne or not? Because he's not really Lucius's son. He's an adopted stepson. That would make a really interesting plot line, don't you think?
It would. However, Steve, a cautionary note here. It is Lucius who calls for the dismemberment of Alarbus in Act 1. I really didn't want to know that. I didn't want to see that, because he's the guy that you're going to put all your faith in at the very end of the play. But there's an ironic twist when you think about how all this misadventure started with the, dismemberment and a violation that occurred to Tamara's eldest son. So Lucius has a little bit taint on him. He's not
theatrically, we would call that a magnificent character arc. From the first scenes of the play to the last scenes of the play. Look at the transition. Look at the dynamic transition that character makes through all that he sees and witnesses based on that really terrible decision.
Yes. Well, I think you can see it from that point of view and in terms of character development, but it's really the suffering of Lavinia and Titus that is the center focus of all the horrible things that happened to people on that during that play. And if female suffering moves you, this play will really get you.
That's true indeed. So I hope you listeners, if you've shied away from Titus, I hope that listening to this episode will help you to embrace the play, go back and reread it with a different lens, and look for some of these hints and allusions and messages and themes that we have covered here today on today's program. I want to thank you, as always, for choosing us. There are so many thousands of different podcasts out there, but you listeners have selected to include us on your list, and we appreciate that. So thrilled and excited about how much growth we have seen in our numbers. Fellow Quillers, you continue to astound me, and I continue to love to receive your feedback. Don't forget, you can write to me by sending an email to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Send me your ideas, send me your recommendations, send me your revelations, send me your criticisms, send me your angry messages as well. Don't forget, the anniversary episode will be coming up soon, our 3rd anniversary episode, where Jake, our producer, will join me, and we will read some of your comments aloud on the air. If you haven't listened to previous anniversary episodes, go back and find them. They're a lot of fun. You get to hear what some of you have to say during the episode, and Jake is a wonderful sidekick on those episodes. We enjoy doing that. We'll be doing that again sometime in January, so watch for that. Thank you for joining us again. Don't forget, if you want to learn more, you can find more information than you will know what to do with by going to ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. It is your source and resource for everything Shakespeare authorship question. Go do a deep dive there, rabbit hole yourself into whatever your questions are, because remember, what we want to constantly encourage and enforce here on this program is that each scholar, and yes, even if you're just discovering the Shakespeare authorship question, you are now a Shakespearean scholar, and each scholar has to find their own journey, complete their own journey, look through and answer their own questions, and come to their own realizations and beliefs about what the answer to this incredible mystery truly is. And we encourage you to do that by using ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org as a resource, as well as some of the other resources that we have mentioned in previous programs. Remember, fellow Quillers, the most important thing, the one thing that I will always impart to you at the end of every episode: keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.